Hello and welcome to Infinite Progress, a series of discussions based around worldviews. We'd like to welcome you back to this program. We've been having a fascinating time looking at how different worldviews have to address some of the most important questions in life, and it centers around ethics and politics and jurisprudence and law. And today we're going to move into education. Now this series has to do with worldviews and contrasting worldviews. So while it is the intent of this program to highlight many areas where two different and diverging worldviews can come together and agree on, it is not the intent of this program to erase those differences, but only to provide a context where they can be discussed in a civil manner. So today we have our same guests back. We have Landon Mosley with us, and we have Dustin Chalker. I'm going to let them introduce themselves to you, and then we'll go right into the subject for today.
Thank you, Tony. Thank you, Dustin, for coming out again for another dialogue, buddy. My name is Landon Mosley, and I had completed my fellowship with the International Academy of Apologetics, Human Rights, and Evangelism of Strasbourg, France last year, so I will be representing the Christian faith. Dustin.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Landon, for having me again. It's a pleasure to be here today. My name is Dustin Chalker. I am an atheist. I'm co-founder and administrator of the Mobile Atheist Community, and I'm happy to be here representing the secular perspective.
All right, today's topic will be education. How does your worldview inform your thinking about education? And let me put some of the topics out there. In other words, should religion be a part of the educational system? Should government play a role in determining what its citizens should learn? How does your worldview inform that? How does it play into the issue of science and religion when it comes to education? So I guess to start that off, we'll let Landon talk to us about that and let him tell us how his worldview feeds into that.
Yeah.
How does the theistic worldview feed into and inform education?
Yeah, thank you, Tony. And to claim that I'm representing a unified Christian consensus in aspects of education would be crazy to try to state that, but just giving some general outlines as far as what's becoming popular, at least within Christian circles. Obviously, the homeschool movement has been something that's been on the rise, and private colloquial classical education for private Christian schools that take the trivium approach. And basically, the way that's structured is you're starting out with the classical language studies, okay, and the basic content, the way that Christians are people of the book. So obviously, we care about literacy to the best of our ability that we can teach it. And so we're going to start with entry to classical language studies, which would be Latin, Greek, and because Latin being the source of English language, it sort of helps with meaning, word formation, and those types of things, so it gives a good basic structure to help with that. It would also help appreciation with literature as you study literature all throughout history, as you have that basic background of understanding language and discerning and ciphering language. You have an appreciation for all forms of literature. It helps understand the infancy of our civilization. I think that is a pretty vital role in how the Greco-Roman influence our historical development. And you need to understand your history in order to mature. I think it's quite foolish to think that we just dropped on Earth in 1776 from nowhere. No, there was influences that built up to that, and that would be ingrained within the education, and that would allow for cultural diversity in history, to understand the differing cultures and their impacts and movements and flow and development in history, because human nature is something that is sacred to God, and so it seems to be something pertinent that Christians would want to know about, the historical development of all cultures. And another important point, and this leads into the science part, it's essential to scientific method, because it sets up, when you're starting off with this basis as an educational approach, it allows for observation, comparison, and generalizations. This is kind of narrows it down to a learned precision sort of approach. And it sort of helps the study with other modern languages. And so the three stages of education go from the grammar to the dialectic to the rhetoric. And in general, these are some of the principles that the Christian worldview feeds into the aspect of education. I think we'll keep it at general. I will address the science-religion interaction. Go ahead and let Dustin just talk about the in general education, and then maybe we can do some back and forth on the science-religion interaction.
General education.
If that's
how does your worldview inform that? What does secularism have to say about about education?
Sure. I mean, I think we would agree on the scope of education and the things that should be taught. You've got to teach language, history, science. The real question that I would want to get down to and drill down is the role of government in education and whether or not government needs to have a role. And, this is a subject that up to this point we've been talking about ethics and politics, and it's all about, these institutions and prescriptive things like how should you behave, what laws should exist. With education, it's a little more arbitrary. Are we going to teach history from 1700s on, or are we going to teach history from 1800s on? What grade should a person learn this subject or that subject? There are a lot of arbitrary things that really don't matter as long as it gets taught. So we can't make, and I wouldn't try to make prescriptive moral statements of the way that education should be taught. I'd just say that it needs to be based on empirical study of what's most effective with kids, what actually works, and also leaving people the freedom to do it themselves. So I think that government's role in education probably shouldn't exist. Government is extremely ineffective at practically everything that it does. It messes up everything it touches. It does it more expensively than the market does, and it also doesn't serve all populations as equally as it should. So when we look at the record, if you normalize test scores based on public school kids, you normalize it to the 50th percentile so that the average public school kid, that's the 50th percentile. Private schools work approximately in the 60th percentile range. The kids are doing 10 percentile points better, which means the percentile means that out of 100 people, you do better than that many, and you do worse than however many is on the other end. So the 50th percentile means you did better than 50 people out of 100. The 75th percentile would be you did better than 75 people, and 25 did better than you. So if you normalize it, public school kids average 50th percentile, and you do the math so that that's the norm. Private schools score in the 60s. Homeschoolers score in the 80th percentile, between 80 and 90, right? Homeschoolers are crushing government-educated kids, just absolutely crushing it. And so I think that that's the most effective approach to education. I think it allows for market innovation. It allows you to follow the child and their interests, and they learn more when they're learning what they want to learn. And, you look at disparities in different social and racial groups based on income level and race, and in the public schools, there are huge disparities. Even though the average is centered on the 50th percentile, there are huge income and racial disparities in how these kids are taught. Homeschooling completely eliminates those. There is a 3-point gap between the richest and the poorest kids who are homeschooled. It's like the 83rd percentile and the 86th, right? So homeschooling is extremely egalitarian in that respect. And so, general education, I think that letting the market innovate is the best approach, and that's the approach that I support.
Let me follow up on that too,
Yeah.
Dustin. Why do you think that is? Why do you think that the homeschool kids tend to score, like you said, around the 80 percentile?
Right.
And the reason I'm asking this is people watching, some people who are absolutely for homeschool, you're exactly right. How is this so when most of the people who are doing the teaching in the home may not have a background in education? So why do you think that is?
Sure. There is some research on this. One thing that I think plays a role, research has shown that waking children up so early in the morning is terrible for their cognitive development. When we're waking kids up at 6, 7 in the morning and shipping them off to school, you're destroying their brains. I mean, that's really hurting these kids. And in the classroom, they're packed like sardines in a can, and they're surrounded by other students in the classroom. They don't have the individual one-on-one instruction. They also have to deal with bullies because there are, unfortunately, children in school who come from homes where they're mistreated, and they go into the school and they mistreat their peers. And finally, there's just all of the social pressure and the social elements of trying to conform. And the kids stop worrying about the lesson in front of them, and they're worried about mastering their social environment. So I think you introduce all those distractions into a child's education. And, well, I should also throw it out there once more, government's extremely ineffective. So, and you know, that also plays a role. So I think government's bad at its job.
Do you think that pulling the kids out of a social environment somehow hinders their ability to function socially? And the reason I ask that, let's say I'm going to take the position, and I'm not, but let's say I play the devil's advocate on this. And I'm debating you on this, and I'm saying, for number one, you got a person that's absolutely, soccer mom is not qualified. She's got no graduate degrees in education. She has no training, let's say in the area of mathematics. She's a soccer mom. She has no experience teaching. You've isolated your kid. You put them in an environment where they don't have to wake up at a certain time. When they get out in the real world, they are, because they've got to clock in. Works don't let you do that. Some places do, but for the most people, you can't work from home, especially if you're doing manual labor. They're not in an environment where they're actually challenged. Maybe the kid's very smart. Maybe the teacher and your wife or whoever's doing the teaching in the home is only good up to maybe 8th grade math. You got no ability for that kid to bounce ideas off of somebody else. You got no ability for that kid to have to deal socially with all the different complexities that we happen, which bullying is a part of life. It translates into work as well. So you basically isolate the kid. The first time you get them out in the open, they don't know what to do. So how is homeschooling really beneficial to a kid's development as a productive citizen in this world?
Yes, I mean, you learn from life. When it comes to social, let's break it down. You talk about socializing and then having exposure to the subjects. When it comes to socializing, being stuck in a room with your peer group forcibly is not the definition of being socialized, right? Just being around people who are your own age all the time, that's not real life. Real life, you deal with people who are younger, older, different beliefs, and you're not in situations where you're just forced to sit there in your chair next to the other person. You know, you get up, you move around, you talk. Homeschool kids get that. And they interact with adults. They're not learning to, you know, you're going to spend like the first 10% of your life socializing with other kids. You're going to spend the other 90% of your life with adults. So why are we calling it socializing to have them waste time socializing with just kids? That's not who you spend your life socializing with. So homeschool kids, they're getting a range of human beings to interact with. They're interacting with kids maybe their own age, siblings, neighbors, whatever. But they're also interacting with teens and adults and other people, and they're learning how to interact with the wide range of humanity and not this narrow slice of humanity. So they are being socialized. And the exposure to subjects that perhaps the parents don't particularly know very well. Most homeschooling groups, they do get together and they do have experiences where the kids can study under another parent, or the kids have access to books, kids have access to the internet. They can learn what they want to learn. It doesn't matter if mom can teach it or not. Kids can learn it. My youngest son, I taught, all my boys were reading by 3 years old. And I put a lot of effort into the first one, getting him there. And he taught a lot to his brother, and I had less time to invest in my life at the time, and so he taught his brother. And then the youngest kid, who's growing up now, he entirely taught himself. We never sat down and taught him. And the kid's like reading now; he knows all his letters and everything, and simple phonetic words. He's not reading massive philosophical tracts or anything.
Not yet, anyway.
But as far as a simple phonetic word that is pronounced the way it's spelled, yeah, he can read those, and taught himself that from his brothers and from TV shows. And we never actually invested the time in him that we did with his brothers, but he could still teach himself. And kids have that ability. They want to learn if you don't stick them in a sardine can and crush the will to learn out of them.
So statistically, we have data that shows that kids that are brought up in a homeschool environment, a good one. Now, you have to do your job.
Sure, yeah.
Actually test better socially or better apt to deal with
Yeah.
other members in society, and they're in a safer environment.
Yes. Yeah.
Good point. As a Christian now, theist, Christian, I'm going to get specific.
Mm-hmm.
You believe in homeschool? And number two, is it wrong for a person who holds a theistic or a Christian worldview to send their kids to public school?
Yeah, and I think that's what Christians are battling with. I'm
Yeah.
certainly for the freedom of it. Man, there's not a whole lot I can add to that, Dustin. That was just fantastic defense of homeschooling. I just simply, in the house of God, amen. All of those stats and data. But as far as, is it sinful? I don't think so. I think parents do struggle with that. I think you have to be careful what your children are learning, the environment that you're in. I think with just the availableness of technology, I think your children may be exposed to things at an earlier age that will be much more difficult to overcome when they get older. It's sort of forcing a level of maturity on minds that may not be ready for it. That's kind of the negative of technology in that sense. But there are some that, as Christians, maybe not at the youngest ages, but they see a school, and this is purely theological at this point, if public schools exist, is that they see it as a mission field. There are some young children, by the time they hit age 12, 13, 14, they want to be in an environment where everybody's not like them. They genuinely welcome the challenge, and they look forward to interacting with that many people, exposing them to different thoughts, ideas, so on and so forth. They want the social interaction. And so that's something that can be welcomed. There's not really, I think, a whole lot of conviction that would be adamantly opposed to that from a purely prescriptive level. I think one of the other aspects of this is there would have to be some sort of gradual shift, and that's what's difficult. Is a lot of times we want a quick, abrupt change in how things are running, even if it is in education, and that there would have to be a slow shift, because there are, as sad as it is, there are certain areas in our country that the only 2 meals some children get is the 2 meals they have at public school. And so it's become so integrated in our culture that there has to be something, if it's in the tax system or what have you, to allow more of these market solutions, these private schools, to be able to reach these impoverished children that don't have any other option. That if there was no government-mandated school, there would literally be no options for certain kids. They're in such an area, they're so impoverished, again, they're malnourished, and whatever the situation may be. If they're in a neglected situation, this allows something to speak to that. This allows individuals to address that, where maybe humanitarian aid has to come in.
Yeah.
Maybe a child is being neglected or abused or something, and a teacher can observe that and see, hey, this kid's in an abusive home. We need to step in and do something. So that's a benefit. So I don't want to completely marginalize and demonize the entire program of public school, their necessity. There can be, I want to say it like that, there can be a place. Now, market-driven private schools could replace that. I would love to see that integration begin to take place to allow market-driven schools to be able to do that.
I think you both bring up good points, and to Dustin's point, I think he's dead on, that there's so much of a vested interest in the child or the student when there's teaching being done in the home versus having 30 kids being run through, and all the teacher's trying to do is get through so many classes a day and get to 3:30. I can say that because I know my wife is in the educational system. She's seen the trends through time, and so it's very tough. And I think you bring up a good point too, in that if the home is not capable of doing the teaching, there's a lot of homes that you have parents there have not been to school. They're not capable. Some of them can't read or write.
Yeah.
So it's very hard for them. So there is that avenue in the public school system. But I think you qualified it by saying if it's market-driven now, that's going to change the whole face of education and the quality of teachers as well.
Right.
And so that's a good point.
So, one of the points that I mentioned, the reduced disparities. So in public schools, when you look at those impoverished kids, those kids who don't have educated parents who are teaching them in the home and things like that, in public schools, those disparities continue to exist and they grow larger. You take those kids and you homeschool them, even in those homes with the lower income and with the racial problems or whatever it is, even in those environments and even in those homes, those kids are outperforming public school peers.
Wow.
They are barely under the rich kids, right? So you just make the materials available to them, and they teach themselves. Kids can do this given the opportunity. And I think we've got a system right now that takes away their opportunity and strips them of the will to do it. And, I think homeschooling is almost the universal solution to that problem.
Good point. All right, the next two questions are going to be pretty tough, and we're going to be time limited. And I want to get both of these in because I want both of your guys' perspective on it. Our next set of questions are going to be dealing with around religion and education, and then science and religion and education. So let me throw the first one out like this, and I'll give it to you, Landon, to start with. Should religion be taught in the public educational system as either a part of the classics, or is bringing that in any other form, just having it as part of the curriculum in the public educational system? Would theism be opposed to that, or would it welcome something like that?
There's several answers to it. I guess granting the situation, since we've agreed we want to try to get the idea of public state-mandated education out, but since that's not going anywhere tomorrow, let's deal with what we have. So given your premise, given your question, given our situation, I would say, I'm going to sound a little libertarian here, but let the community decide. If you have a community and a school board that decides we want to implement a full plenary view of religious options where high school students are going to have electives of classic Hinduism, Buddhism, Islam, Judaism, Christianity, and so on, I certainly don't see any problem with that whatsoever. To mandate it, to force religious teaching at a state level in public schools, I don't quite see the benefit of that. We were talking earlier, Daniel Dennett would like to see that, I think, prescribed, that to learn all religions from the time of kindergarten by the time they graduate, to have a forced, broad religious education. I think there is something private to that. Now, what I would say is, on the backhand, again, going back to religious protection, I don't want anything hostile forced on it either. So, as it spills into certain aspects of science, if the education, I think parents ought to have freedom with their children, that if something is being taught in the class that is contrary to their convictions, that they ought to have the freedom to opt out of certain things. You may have, there's been a lot of stories of New Age teachers that want to implement times of meditation with their students and things like that, and I think they ought to have the freedom to opt out of that and not be held against them. So I think as long as the religious protection is still implemented within that, then that's fine. But if a community and a school board has agreed to a certain curriculum as elective, I don't see any problem with it whatsoever.
All right, there's some Christians who hold the position that our public educational system should have Bible readings every morning on the intercom, or each teacher should lead it, and there should be a prayer said, or the Lord's Prayer said before every class. Is that wrong?
In the public sector, that's incredibly difficult, I think, to pull off without, as we talked about earlier, you're just legislating hypocrisy. There's really no reason to force people to act like Christians who really aren't in that grand scheme. But I would say that if there is a community and it's public, and the community and the school board elects to allow this type of freedom, and they want, but if somebody of a different religious persuasion wants to opt out of hearing it, give them the freedom to, that's where kind of these freedoms overlap each other a little bit. And that's tough to monitor, that's tough to regulate, and I anticipate what I'm saying is much easier theoretically than it is practically, but I think in general, to have respect for other people and have respect for those that differ in our opinions on those particular issues, I would welcome a community getting together that says we would like to open our sessions with scripture reading or prayer or whatever the case may be, and it not be mandated for all students. We're just allowing our teachers to be able to do so, and if the teacher wants to do it, then that's her freedom to do so.
Dustin, what should religion be taught in the public school system, and are we opening up a can of worms by allowing that to happen?
Sure. So,
from the secular viewpoint.
So, religion in history class is unavoidable, and it's going to be are we teaching the tenets of the religion, or are we just going to very simply say this is a monotheistic religion from this region of the world, and it was what people believed, and here's the history of what happened in that part of the world. So, yeah, I think you have to teach that religion exists. You have to teach objectively that there was this group of people who believed this, and that was the predominant belief system of that time, and they were fighting and warring against this group that believed a different thing. So it's an inseparable part of history. I don't think you teach the tenets of the religions in history class. I don't think that's necessary beyond some very basic, simple, this one's monotheistic and this one's polytheistic, whatever. So, you very simple introductions there would be appropriate and would be okay. Those are objective facts of reality, and that's what we should be teaching. Now, we start talking about science class, religion has no place in a science class. Science is empiricism, and religion does not do empiricism. So that's not the place for it. Now, letting the community decide, that's not actually a libertarian approach. That's mob rule. That is saying, well, because 90% of the community, and hey, we're in America, 80% of all cities in the United States are Christians. So, are you going to have an 80% majority everywhere? Pretty much. So letting the community decide means, yeah, put it in there. And, schools are government entities. Government, as we've discussed before, and assuming that we're talking about public schools here and all that, even though we obviously agree that they shouldn't be there, shouldn't operate the way that they do. They're government entities, and we've talked about before that government is us coming together and saying, let's create a defensive association, so if some violent psychopath wants to be a violent psychopath, we can throw him in a cage, all right? That's all government is. Now, I don't want to enter a relationship with people who want to take our collective company that we start together, or government that we start together, or whatever it is, and plaster their beliefs all over the walls of that entity. So schools, being government agencies, should not be in the business of promoting any belief system over others. It shouldn't promote my belief system, shouldn't promote your belief system. They shouldn't be, you shouldn't, every morning before class, you shouldn't get on the intercom and say, there's no God, Hey guys, seriously, there's no God. Seriously, hey, does anybody disagree? If you disagree, get up and leave the room so we can talk about how there's no God, right? That would be wrong. It's absurd. It's ridiculous. Hey, Ganesh and Krishna and all the, no. You don't need to use government as a vehicle to promote beliefs. And if you're doing so on an intercom, and you're doing so through government schools, you're not talking about teaching your own kids that stuff, because you already teach your kids. You're talking about getting access to my children. You're talking about the secular kids in the schools and what you want them to hear. So, no, I don't believe in using government education systems as a vehicle to proselytize my children. Absolutely not.
Okay. All right. Now, here's the tough question. Hot button for today.
All right.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to tell you, this is going to be hot. Dustin's got a pair of black boots on. He's got a knife in the one on the right over here, so this is going to be tough. Science and education and religion. I want to give this to you first. Should religious views of the origin of this universe be taught alongside evolution and naturalism? In other words, should our public school systems be allowed to teach both views in a public setting? If so, why? If not, why do you think it's going to open up a can of worms by doing so?
Yeah, you kind of briefly touched on it just now, but you know, if we're talking public schools, again, those are government entities that I'm paying for, and my kids are in it. Absolutely not. No.
Okay, what about the counter argument? What about the Christian family that says, hey, my kids are in it, it's a government school, I don't want them necessarily to hear that.
And it's a science class, and science is about empiricism and what can be empirically proven. And I know you're going to disagree, but the science is settled on certain subjects, and there is no rational debate among scientists about whether evolution occurred or not, for instance.
So on that basis, you're trying to bring something in. In other words, the argument's not the same because you're trying to bring something that's not rationally verifiable.
It doesn't fit the criteria. I mean, it's
so it doesn't belong in the science class itself.
Yeah. So if, for instance, if the Bible had some historical things that it talked about that we proved these things did not occur, they absolutely did not occur in history, and you were trying to insert those things into a history class, it does not belong in that class. It's not history. So, I mean, it's the same thing with science. We have the empirical evidence to prove the scientific view, and it is not science to insert creationism into that class. If it were a religion class, I wouldn't come in there and say, hey, let's insert science into your religion class. We're not talking about a religion class, we're talking about science class. And I think the subject of science should be taught as science using, my tax money. And, when you're teaching, and especially all right, we're talking about, remember, children who aren't necessarily of your belief system. So you can't take your belief system and force children to learn that in a public school. No.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's going to be tough to kind of squeeze this in, but I think there's a false dichotomy between the two. I think religion has helped influence the aspect of science because what Christians believe is that the book of nature, what we call natural theology, is actually getting to understand God much better as his creation. Now, what you're stating as far as what can be empirically verified and that there's a consensus in science, there's not really a consensus in science on almost anything, that you will find dissenting influence on almost any number of topics, especially when you get beyond the present lab. Like basically it gets down to what's going to be the mode of experimentation, like what is your mode and what is the control group, what can be duplicated, what's assumed on the back end of that. There's actually 8 definitions of evolution that are typically used. So which, if you're just talking moderate change that we observe, then that's something that's taught. But when you're talking descent with modification from a single cell as a full comprehensive worldview, as almost a meta-narrative, then that comes under strict challenges. And I think I want to highlight a couple notes from a recent lecture given by Alvin Plantinga on the superficial conflict between science and religion. There's no conflict between what is testable, observable science and confessional Christianity, especially when you're talking about physics and chemistry. No biology per se that fits in with what we talk the minor or the micro level of evolutionary thought. A conflict can arise between Christianity and what you would call psychology or other forms of psychology possibly, but as far as and that could be extrapolated to evolutionary psychology, but there shouldn't be a conflict there. The conflict is purely superficial. The scientific procedure is a methodological naturalism constrains on the evidential base. And so basically what is structured within the scientific method is this control group as a methodology, and no Christian would have, is what I tried to lay out earlier as one's learning the laws of logic and calculus and the like within the Christian worldview. You're understanding and learning experimentation, methodology, test, observe, repeatable, and so on and so forth without extrapolating back any farther than what the data is presenting. Now, there can be some convergent lines. Let's say you want to implement what you're learning in geology with what appears to be going on in paleontology, what you see in biology, and so on. those things may not necessarily connect with one another to form this neo-Darwinian meta-narrative. And so I don't have any problem in the science classroom with learning about development, gene mutation, again, chemistry, physics, and the like. But when it gets extrapolated into, as a Christian parent, yeah, I would have problems saying that you are, in fact, and using that terminology, in fact, just a progressed ape and chimpanzee in that sense. And that's simply all you are, and reduce somebody merely to that. I think that conflict ought not to exist. And then the superficial concord between naturalism and science. Okay, to accept naturalism and evolution means that the probability of cognitive faculties is being reliably low. And what that states is you could be undercutting yourself if you're implementing a Darwinian mechanism that it's going to lead to the undercutting of naturalism, because at what point do you trust your own cognitive faculties? Now, that's a deeper philosophical undercutting of the entire methodology, but in general, those are just some basic kind of conflicts that may not arise that need to allow that kind of thing. Now, in history, I know John Draper of One After Darwin was alleging a conflict between religion and science, and here were some of the historical examples. You have the Galileo view, and this comes from a lecture by Jay Richards, was that that's a very complex issue. Galileo was sort of antithetical to the Pope, and there were some other things that led into that. The Scopes trial, that's not really been recorded entirely true. The Wilberforce-Huxley debate, that happened 1 year after the origins. Well, it didn't happen that way. That story was put out 30 years later. A lot of that is hoax. So the main point of it is a lot of these alleged controversies don't really exist that way. And even within the scientific community, you don't have a universal consensus on all things on these metaphysical planes. Stephen Meyer, if you look in World Magazine, he was interviewed 3 issues ago and stated that he had received a phone call from a top scientist in Europe about his doubt of the Darwinistic mechanism, but he's not allowed to go public with it because of the intellectual pressure. We know Guillermo Gonzalez, his tenureship was pulled at Iowa State because of his work on the Privileged Planet and other things. So because of this oppression within the scientific community, it doesn't allow free thought. The alleged free thought is not there. They're not allowed to ask these basic questions of the evolutionary mechanism. And in education, we want that.
Let me follow up with you a question. I'm gonna pitch a question to you from Dustin's side. I'm paying for my kid to go to school to learn science, and under the umbrella of science, I'm gonna use it as the broadest terms. And we're gonna study physics. Force equals mass times acceleration. I can take a known mass, I can accelerate it, I can measure that, and I can create, or not create, or actually tell you the force that comes from that. I can test it. You tell me God created the universe. Test it. I can't. And you're putting it in a science class.
Mm-hmm.
I'm paying for my kid to learn how to do things,
Right.
and it doesn't belong. Why do I want to subject my kid to that? Maybe if he wants to sign up for a philosophy class, yeah. But in the area of science, he's not bringing me anything home he can test. How do you answer that as a theist?
Yeah, and I think that's tough because, and I'm not going to be able to illustrate it here, but you have
That's why we're going to have to have another section on this.
Well,
We'll
I
have to
mean,
come back
in
to
a
it.
sense, you may have to, because we're talking about laws of nature and we're getting into information science and sort of, what is, and information is immaterial. So what are the structures within the scientific lab that gets into aspects of information, epigenetics, and so on that would allow for the fleet flight, basically allow the results to say what it is. The early scientists with Sir Isaac Newton, Johannes Kepler, and so on, did not have a problem. Their theology did not restrict them from uncovering and doing scientific research. I do have a list here of several prominent scientists that have a creationist perspective that have made enormous contributions. Dr. Raymond Damidian is the inventor of the MRI device. Dr. Raymond Jones, gold medallion winner, detoxified Louisiana for livestock consumption. Dr. Kurt Wise, PhD in paleontology under Stephen Jay Gould at Harvard. I've got 50, 60-some list of doctors and PhDs that's made significant contributions in the scientific community that have a creationist perspective. So if creationism or a theological framework did absolutely nothing to the benefit of scientific community, I wouldn't be able to address names of some of these individuals. Now, the reason some of them aren't as popular as others is, again, there's, I think, an intellectual commitment to a priori rule out any kind of theological understanding into the scientific experiment. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that it creates a laziness and that there's a God of the gaps. So, it's going to hinder your science because you're going to quit asking questions. Well, it hasn't stopped it in the past, and it doesn't really stop it, but it does understand that there are certain questions that you cannot ask in a lab looking through a microscope.
Okay.
When you're
Good point. Good point. Now I'm going to bring this to Dustin, because I know Dustin's chomping at the bits because he's taking notes.
Okay.
In my simple experiment that I'm trying to calculate a force by mass times acceleration, it's really a test that tells me it's the how question. I can understand how it's kinematic. I can know how something moves. And as we've discussed before, science deals specifically with the how. The why is not what we're concerned about. It's science. But does that not mean there are other disciplines that we need to bring alongside our science that are fitted and are weighted and do have the tools and do have the capacity to help us with the why questions? In other words, just like Hawking said in A Brief History of Time, he made it, I'm just going to throw it off the cuff, he just paraphrased, he said, the hows we study in science, the why we don't know. Only God would have to answer that question. Of course, he doesn't believe in God. Theoretically, it's possible. It could be, but he's just saying that in our realm, the why is not there. But he does not say that the why is not a valid question, and he does not believe that there may be other classics, the cosmologists, the philosophers, who can, maybe the theologians, maybe theology, the queen of science, who was that at one time, can come alongside our observations and help us with the why part, because the science in and of itself doesn't have that capacity to go that route. It's doing everything it can to give us the how. But at some point, like even Krauss would say, Lawrence Krauss would say, we got to start looking at, wonder why this is. So would it be wrong to bring something in that may have the possibility to do that for us? Or would it confuse the whole issue?
Well, science is
in
not
2 minutes or less.
2 minutes or less, all right. Well, science is not a standalone pursuit. It's grounded in logic, right? You have to have logic first in order to do science. So I would never say science is the only approach to knowledge. You have logic and syllogisms and mathematics and these other pursuits and other ways of knowing. The question why implies a conscious, intentional actor, right? So you cannot have an answer to that question unless there is a conscious, intentional actor that you're talking about. Like, why is the hammer shaped this way? Because the guy who made the hammer designed it with this feature and that feature in mind. So if you ask the question why, and you're referring to nature, then you are implicitly assuming that the answer is a conscious acting agent. And so you're begging the question, and you're trying to get the answer that you want out of it. So when I talk about a consensus among scientists, the general population is predominantly religious. They're 85% theistic. Among scientists, that number drops precipitously to 30%. And even among the very small group of scientists who believe in a God, those scientists who are theists, they agree that, or they believe that God guided the process of evolution, but that it definitely occurred because they see the empirical evidence that's completely ironclad and undeniable. So when we talk about a consensus, less than 2% of scientists are creationists. Less than 2% believe in creationism without evolution. And so, it's very easy to come up with a list of 60 people when we're talking about a group of people that's, million scientists, but less than 2% believe in this. And so it is completely accurate to say that there is a consensus among scientists just because there is a very, very tiny group of dissenters who are engaging in motivated reasoning and coming to the conclusion that they want to come to does not mean that there's not a consensus among 98% of scientists.
And you don't think that the atheist could be motivated for the exact same reason, point one. Point two, you wanted to refute my statistic of prohibition. I can refute your statistic by psychological pressure because, like Guillermo Gonzalez and others, they know they're not going to get tenure if they express their religious views because of the persecution intellectually from the higher level academy. And I would ask who were those that were polled? Because there was another George Barna poll that was given that among educated with bachelor's degree and higher, the doubt in evolutionary mechanism has actually risen since the 90s from 9% to 22% that have began to doubt this because of information sciences. We're talking at the biogenetic level. So to say that there's a consensus opinion amongst the scientific community, and another logical fallacy that you're violating here, just because majority of people say it's right, does it make it right? If most of the population of secular scientists are atheistic, does that necessarily make it right? Because, and you know, you're stating the motivation. I can trace the history all the way from James Hutton, all the way up, that the whole scientific endeavor from Charles Lyell through all the way up, Thomas Huxley has been motivated to promote atheism. That they will even skew the data so as to promote the atheistic idea. So that knife cuts both ways.
So when you talk about people with bachelor's degrees, when I talk about scientists, I'm talking about people with PhDs. And the group who was polled was scientists with PhDs. And the poll done by Gallup was anonymous so that the scientists didn't have to put their name on it. So this is really looking at what their views are, not the view that they have to publicly profess.
We'll have to cut it off. We need to come back and do that.
We do.
Because I'm gonna say this. This is a very good subject. I think it's worthy of another program just to talk about that, because I think there's some misunderstandings on both sides of it. But I think it's a very, very good subject to discuss that. Mm-hmm. Exactly what we classify as science, what can be known, at what point are we interjecting thought into it that's not there, and to think about the whole history of that. There's quotes going to be brought on both sides that are very good. And this is what I'd like to say in closing this, and we got one more minute, I'll close. I think these quotes are important for one reason, and that it shows us that the issue is not firmly settled in humanity. And there are people on both sides of the discussion, both secular and Christian, who are fabulous scientists that have totally different views on this subject, and it fascinates me what they think about it. And just to have that to listen to is just worth discussion anyway. But I appreciate it. Thank you for joining us in this section. You can see this is a very hot topic. We need to come back and just kind of dive back into this and just kind of break it down, because it's surely a hot issue. Thank you for listening to us. Inform your worldview, because what you believe matters. Thank you.